Again, good morning. Hope you're feeling well. Let's get back to macroeconomics. And of course, what we are doing right now is we're discussing how macroeconomists think about the business cycle using the theory of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And today I want to take a slightly different angle. Rather than starting by reminding ourselves of how the theory of aggregate demand, aggregate supply works, what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the data that motivated the development of this theory. And so this will be a little bit, I guess, of economic history once again. So there is something that is a staple of macroeconomics, or at least has been for a very long time, that some of you, those of you who are interested in economics and may have read about it before coming here, may have heard about. And that's something that's called the Phillips curve. So who of you has heard about the Phillips curve before? Quite a few of you. So I want to start by actually telling you about it, linking it to our theories, and then telling you why, when we start discussing macroeconomics, we didn't actually start with the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve was something discovered by, obviously, an economist whose name was Phillips. And what he did was that a long time ago, I think if I'm not mistaken in the 60s, maybe in the 50s, what he did was he wanted to see whether there was a relationship between some of the key macroeconomic aggregates that we care about. And by that I don't mean a relationship in theory, I mean a relationship in the data. Those key aggregates were the unemployment rates and the inflation rates. And of course, why do we care about these aggregates? Well, we all understand that unemployment is a problem. If unemployment is very high, it means lots of people are out of work, which means that the economy must not be doing very well. But if there's high inflation, that's also a problem because, of course, we know high inflation erodes the real value of your earnings. And so that also is something that would likely indicate a dysfunctional economy. So what he did was he took data and he plotted on these axes the combination of unemployment and inflation for various years. So let's say in 1948, the unemployment rate was this, and the inflation rate was this. So we put a dot there for that year. And then 1949, you have an unemployment rate that's this, and an inflation rate that's this. So we plot that. And so on. And we do that for the different years for which we have data. And what Mr. Phillips discovered was that you could draw basically a line through all these points. And it was a downward sloping line. So this is the Phillips curve. It's a negative relationship that we observe, or at least that he observed back then, between inflation and unemployment. And that was interpreted in at least two different ways. One was just, okay, so this is how the economy behaves. And so when we develop theories of the business cycle, we should develop a theory of the business cycle that accounts for this, right? That's the first thing, which we'll do in a second. Second, if you're a policymaker, let's say you run the Fed, you might look at this and say, well, that's unfortunate. As the Fed chairperson, I don't like unemployment. I don't like inflation either. This would seem to suggest that I can decide which one I want to prioritize fighting, but if I fight unemployment, I can only do so at the cost of having high inflation. If I fight inflation, I can only do so at the cost of having high unemployment. So that's another common interpretation of this figure, which we will debunk. But anyway, if we see high inflation going with low unemployment and vice versa, how does that work in the theory that we've developed so far, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework? So here is our framework. Our framework says that we tend towards long-run equilibrium, but as we discussed, there's a host of different factors that might knock us out of long-run equilibrium, and the factors that we focused on so far are all demand-side factors, right? Whether you're a Keynesian monetarist, mainstream, the factors that knock us off long-run equilibrium are demand curve factors. So how would that look? Let's say it's a positive shock. What does that do here? Well, it's pushing up the price level and increasing GDP, which means that it's lowering unemployment, because you can't make more GDP without hiring more people. So high inflation, low unemployment. Low unemployment, high inflation. It works. Or if it's a negative shock, so we're over here, then you would have lower prices, so low inflation, and slower growth, which means more unemployment. Low inflation, high unemployment. It works. In other words, the Phillips curve is consistent with our theory, or to put it another way, what our theory says is that these data are accounted for if what's going on is that the demand curve is jumping around, right? Or alternatively, maybe, I guess it could be two closely related things. One is that, as we discussed, there are lots of things that move the demand curve. So these things may have been moving the demand curve one way or the other, which traces out this path of high inflation and low unemployment and vice versa. Or maybe the demand curve, let's say, moves into recession, and then the Fed or the government both use fiscal or monetary stabilization policy to push us back, right? Either way, it works. It just means we live in a world where the demand moves around, either because of shocks that we experience or because it's the government trying to deal with those shocks. Right? It all fits together. Until it didn't fit together anymore, because sooner or later, we started to see things that didn't fit this Phillips curve anymore. Say, the early 1970s, we started to get numbers like this. Not only did they no longer fit the Phillips curve, but they failed to fit the Phillips curve in a very particular way. We started to observe years where not only was inflation really high, but that high inflation wasn't coinciding with low unemployment, it was actually coinciding with high unemployment. Sort of the worst of both worlds. A situation like that, where you experience high inflation and high unemployment, is referred to as stagflation, combination of stagnation and inflation, because economists are such poets. And we want to talk about why it is that stagflation might occur, both because we want to make sure we have a complete theory to talk about different macroeconomic shocks, but also because stagflation is something that is a very, very real threat now. And so we'll talk about stagflation in principle. We'll talk about it also as a threat going forward. So, first of all, we should agree that a point like this, with high inflation and high unemployment, is not consistent with the demand curve moving around. The question is, does that mean that our framework is no longer useful? Not really, because there are possibilities here other than the demand curve jumping around. In particular, what would you expect if the supply curve were the one that moved? And whether or not it happens often, whether or not it's the main driver of the business cycle, that doesn't mean it can't move. Right? If the supply curve were the one moving, what would we expect to see? Let's say if it moved off to the left, what would we get? Let me draw it. First of all, what would we expect to see in such an event? Well, we have prices rising, so that's high inflation. We have slow growth, therefore high unemployment. It checks out. So what this suggests is that, again, it may be that typically it's the demand curve that's moving around, whether it's because they're demand side shocks or because the Fed is dealing with them, and of course the Fed and the government, all they can move is the demand curve themselves. But it may be that every now and then you have a deviation from potential GDP that's driven not by a demand shock, but by a supply shock. So we can account for observations like this. The Phillips curve can't, and that's why, as a student in the earlier section put it, maybe the idea is a little obsolete. But that's fine. This isn't obsolete. This theory can still account for stagflation. It just means that every now and then we have supply side shocks. And when we talked about demand shocks, we did so in 3 steps. The first step was to analyze what kinds of things might lead to a demand shock. Then we talked about how does the economy respond to it if you leave it alone, this self-correcting mechanism. And the third step was what is the appropriate monetary or fiscal policy to deal with it. And so we are going to go through those steps now, but with regards to supply shocks. Most likely, we won't get to the third part where we talk about appropriate policy in the face of supply shocks, but I think we'll have time to get through the first 2 parts. What is behind supply shocks and how does the economy respond to them, adjust to them when they occur? Okay? So that's the plan. So to think about why there might be supply shocks, because we haven't thought about why the supply curve might move, we just said, well, for this kind of observation to occur, it must be that the supply curve moved. So to complete this discussion, we need to figure out, well, what kinds of things might move the supply curve in the first place. And you'll remember that there are 2 sets of things that affect aggregate supply. One set of things that affects aggregate supply are the things that we discussed that affect potential GDP, the things that matter when we're trying to figure out what accounts for long-run economic growth. Technology, quantity of resources available, things like that, right? And those are things that affect both the long run and the short run. But then there was this second set of factors that affects only the short run. You remember what those were? So the other thing, and I guess this, you could root your intuition about this in your microeconomics education. Remember in micro, what are the things that move supply curves? Ultimately, the supply curve in the micro context is basically the cost curve of all the firms in the industry. So, and it slopes up because, of course, to make more, you're generally incurring higher and higher marginal costs. So that suggests that the thing that might move the supply curve around, even on the macro level, is also some sort of cost shock. So supply shocks are equivalently cost shocks. And what are the costs here? Well, what's the cost of producing anything? It's what you have to pay in order to buy the things that you need to make what you're producing. In other words, a cost shock must be related to something that's going on with the prices of your inputs. So we can observe deviations from the Phillips curve where we suffer from inflation and unemployment. Those must be accounted for by some kind of supply shock. This is a negative supply shock because it's reducing output. And just logically using your understanding of this model, it must be that whether there's a cost shock, it stems from some kind of increase in input prices. Any questions or thoughts about the logic there? The next thing, of course, is to try and figure out, well, what input prices are we talking about? And we can do that sort of hand in hand with trying to think about, well, what might have been the cost shock that was responsible for what we observed here in the 70s. So, in the case of the 70s, there's an obvious candidate for a cost shock because there were at least two times during the decade of the 70s when a particular input had a significant increase in prices. And that was, of course, the oil price. So one candidate here that could be behind supply shocks is the price of oil, or I guess more broadly, the price of energy. Now, what's so special about oil? Or I guess energy more broadly? The key problem with oil and energy is that you need them to do anything. If you're making goods, those goods have to get from wherever it is that you made them to wherever it is that the consumer is going to get them. In other words, this is a key input for transportation, and transportation is kind of essential to everything. In addition, even if you're producing services rather than goods, you still need energy because you need electricity to turn the lights on. Like here we're producing educational services, and without any energy I wouldn't be able to give this class because there wouldn't be any lights and you wouldn't be able to see me. And you wouldn't be able to hear me through the microphone, and I wouldn't be able to make the class recording, and so on. So energy is central to the production of anything. And so the price of energy spikes. That might result in this kind of shock. And it's well known that in the 70s, as I mentioned, there were at least 2 rounds of serious energy price hikes because the countries that, the main countries that produce oil sort of got together and decided, you know what, we want to just collectively cut outputs and thus make the price of energy in international markets spike. So that's one possible account. Now, I guess there are two things here. One is, could the oil price be a source of supply shocks? Yes. The second question is, was that what was responsible for the inflation in the 70s? Maybe not, because, as I said, there were these two incidents where the price of oil spiked. I think in the first one it quadrupled. In the second one, I'm not so sure. But those things didn't last for long. So it's not clear how they could lead, at least on their own, to persistent inflation for the entirety of the 70s. Rather than waving my hands, let me show you what inflation looks like over this period. So this goes from 1948 up until the present day almost. Here are the 70s. You can see the 70s. You have rising inflation. The inflation actually starts rising earlier, doesn't it? So that on its own suggests that maybe something else was going on. So maybe the oil price spikes, they probably didn't help. But, you know, throughout the 70s you have the inflation rising until here it reaches almost 14%. That can't have been fun. So that would suggest to me that, yeah, sure, they could have contributed, but they're probably not the whole story. So I'm going to tell you another hypothesis that some economists raised at the time as possibly having been responsible. And again, that discussing any factor has two parts. One is, could it be a source of supply shocks? The second is, could it have been responsible for what we saw there? Because the answer, those two questions could have different answers. And one thing that was thought about at the time, which also actually has to do with energy, as it turns out, is the following. An issue that became more and more politically unavoidable over this period was the fact that in the United States there was an increasing amount of environmental degradation. So, to give you an example, suppose you are going back to energy markets, and we discussed that energy is essential, right, for the production of anything. Suppose you are making electricity, and suppose you make electricity by burning coal. One of the properties of coal is it's very often mixed with various sulfur compounds, and so when you burn coal, you're also burning sulfur and thus giving off sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide goes into the atmosphere and mixes with water and gives you hydrochloric acid, which then rains. So there was a thing, which you probably haven't heard of lately, but back then it was a common thing, called acid rain. They would literally rain hydrochloric acid. And this would get into all the waterways, it would kill animals, it would probably get into the food chain as well. This just sounds nasty, right? And so eventually this became an unavoidable issue, and so the governments at the time passed legislation to try and fight this environmental degradation. And in the specific example that I gave you, specific example are always good, what's the solution? The solution would be to either stop using coal to generate energy, use a different source, or put something on your utilities factory to try and absorb the sulfur before it gets into the atmosphere, right? So in one case, actually in both cases, you're raising the cost of energy and actually also raising the cost of capital, because now suddenly your utility has to have all this additional equipment to either try and deal with emissions, or you have to shut it down and build a new one that uses some different source of energy, whether it's a wind farm or solar or whatever. Back then, those weren't really options. Now they are. So, to sum up, I'm just going to write environmental regulation here, because that's the specific case that we're talking about. But I suppose it's conceivable that other forms of regulation could also increase the cost of doing business. Is that spelled correctly? Yes. So, again, it's debatable whether this was actually the key factor in the 70s. I suspect it wasn't. But again, we do want to have it on our list of possible sources of supply shocks, and the reason why I made a point of putting this on our list of sources of supply shocks is because this is something that we may need to worry about going forward. Have you heard of the green transition? So we've gone from the 70s, where the concern was things like acid rain that are sort of local pollution problems, to a situation where we're worried about climate change and sort of more global impact that various emissions might have. And so there is a movement both here and abroad towards the idea that we should utterly revolutionize our energy sources to make sure that we are no longer using fossil fuels because of the climate impact that they have. Not just acid rain, but changes in the weather that could be destructive. And so if you're going to completely overturn your entire energy system, it will be unavoidable, I think, that you will have to incur significant costs along the way, which raises the concern that whenever this green transition happens, we're going to be dealing with some potentially big supply shocks sometime in the future. So that's why I wanted to bring that up. However, finally, we talked about different input prices here, but we haven't talked about the, I guess you could say, most important input price. What is the most important input in any economy? It's labor. And so that raises the question of whether changes in wages could do something like this. And, well, what mechanism is there that might raise wages? There's one that we haven't talked about. I guess so far we've been thinking of wages as being something that is determined in a market, although that market isn't terribly efficient because there are various frictions and delays involved and long-term contracts and so on, but it is developed in a market. But in some countries, that's not an accurate description of how the labor market works. There's some countries where, rather than workers dealing directly with their employers, you have instead unions. And then what you have is this entity that represents all the workers, and they're heavily involved in the determination of wages. So you could imagine the wages might change on their own depending on what happened with the bargaining between such entities and employers. So that's one possibility. On the other hand, that wouldn't account probably for whatever happens in the United States, because unionization rates are pretty low. But we do have another already example of wages moving, right? When do wages move in our framework so far? Wages move in our framework when they're catching up with other prices. So in other words, we already had a supply shock in our model, but it wasn't a supply shock that was initiating the business cycle imbalance. It was a supply shock that was the economy dealing with it in the first place. Dealing with it on its own. In other words, imagine going back to our normal business cycle framework where there's some demand shock that for some reason leads us out of long-run equilibrium. Remember that we discussed that if you leave things alone and the government doesn't intervene, prices have risen, the wages haven't. Sooner or later, the wages are going to catch up with the other prices, and when the wages start to rise, what does that do? It moves the supply curve. It's the self-correcting mechanism. I guess maybe we wouldn't want to think of that as a supply shock, right? Because it's not the thing that's knocking us out of long-run equilibrium. It's actually a thing that's bringing us back. But along that path, what happens? We have unemployment rising, because it was kind of low there anyway, and inflation, and prices rising, and inflation. So maybe part of this was the economy just closing an inflationary gap. And if we think that might make sense, then we would have to go backwards and say, well, if the stagflation of the 70s was the economy dealing with an inflationary gap, shouldn't we be able to account for step one? Like, we would need something to have happened, not in the 70s, but maybe earlier in the 60s, that opened an inflationary gap. So what was happening in the United States in the late 60s, and I guess early 70s as well, that might have involved pushing the aggregate demand curve out to the right? Well, what's the defining event of that period in American history? The Vietnam War, right? Is that what you're going to say?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. The Vietnam War. And what do you need if you're going to conduct a large war with hundreds of thousands of troops? You need to spend a lot. Well, or to be precise, the government needs to spend a lot. Year after year after year after year. So, year after year after year after year, the government keeps pushing the demand curve to the right. This is very different from how we discussed government's behavior, right? We were saying, well, you know, there are various shocks that the demand curve experiences, and then we discussed, well, given that, how should the government behave? And the answer was, well, there's some pros and cons, but generally the idea would be to push the demand curve back where it was. And instead, now we have the late 60s and early 70s, you have the government not stabilizing the economy, but actually doing the opposite, creating an inflationary gap with large amounts of government spending. And so, of course, sooner or later, what's going to happen? Since the government is not stabilizing, well, eventually you'll have your self-correcting mechanism. And, well, that looks like stagflation, right? If you're going from this point to this point, that looks like stagflation. Any questions, thoughts about this? There is a further complication, which I think we'll probably have to come back to after the midterm, but it's important. And it's a complication that brings up another reason why you could get supply shocks through wages. So remember that our discussion of wages in macroeconomics has revolved around the ideas that the wages are sticky. And so thus, if something unexpected happens, the wages can't respond immediately, and that's why we have this short-run supply curve. That's fine. But now, let's think back to what this implies about what the wages were stuck at in the first place. So, for this discussion, let's imagine that all wages are set through contracts that look like the way I was hired by GW. I think I discussed this with you. I told you that I had a 3-year contract. The contract said, we will pay Professor Samaniego $1 million this year, next year, and the following year. Okay, it wasn't $1 million, unfortunately. How did they come up with that number? Well, when they came up with that number, presumably GW is rational. And so when they came up with that number, they weren't thinking, well, we're choosing this $1 million because of what we think $1 million is worth now. They know this contract is going to tie their hands for 3 years. So they don't just have to have in mind what $1 million is worth now, they also need to have in mind what? The inflation rate over those following 3 years. And of course, do they know what that inflation rate is going to be? No, but they have some forecast. And of course, in this class, whenever you're basing your actions now based on a forecast of something in the future, we refer to it as the expected, in this case, inflation rate. So similarly, when I was looking at this contract and evaluating it, again, I know I'm going to be tied down for 3 years by this contract, so I'm not evaluating it based on what the price level happens to be now. I also, in addition, have in mind the inflation rate I anticipate over the next 3 years. So, if you expect inflation to be 0 over the next few years, the contract looks good or bad, depending on the numbers there. But what if you have the same contract and you expect the inflation rate to be 10% over the next 3 years? That exact same contract doesn't look great anymore, right? I might demand more. Or similarly, the university might look and say, no, $1 million's not enough. We know inflation is going to be high, and we know Professor Samaniego knows that. He's an economist, for Christ's sake. So we'll need to offer him more if we want to attract him. So what does that suggest is one of the determinants of wages. It's expected inflation. So if for some reason we expect inflation to be high in the future, that in itself might shift the supply curve. And this gives us two slightly different ideas for thinking about supply curve movements. One is that you could just say, well, this is how the self-correcting mechanism works, right? Or it's part of how the self-correcting mechanism works. As you're pushed out here, your expected inflation rises because you're observing higher inflation, and that's part of what leads to the self-correcting mechanism closing. However, this could also be an independent reason why the supply curve might move. If something happens that means that we expect high inflation, that moves the supply curve. And interestingly, of course, the supply curve moves. What does that generate? Higher inflation. Which is a bit of a warning, right? That once inflation starts, if it doesn't go away, we realize it's there, start to expect it, and then what that does is move the supply curve, because now it's baked into increasing wages, which then generates even further inflation. So it's a warning that once inflation begins, it could more or less spin out of control, because the inflation, once it becomes expected, raises wages, which is a supply shock, which leads to even more inflation. So that's why this is actually a very important potential factor of inflation that underlines why it's something that we want to fight if we can. Okay. Any questions, thoughts, or comments about that? We will return to the idea of expected inflation as a driver of inflation later on. All right. So I think most economists' interpretation of what happened in the 70s is roughly what I described. That there were various forces pushing, various inflationary forces at work, including the oil prices, the oil price shock, but also including a lot of government spending and so on. And that all these things combined eventually fed into higher expected inflation, and once that happened, the supply curve just keeps moving to the left. So I guess that kind of raises the question of, now that we've discussed what's the direct impact of supply shocks, we're kind of already tiptoeing on the edge of, all right, so what's the economy's response once there is a supply shock? In the case of demand shocks, the answer was there's this self-correcting mechanism, which is actually on the board right now, right? First there's a demand shock, and then a supply shock closes the output gap. But in the case of supply shocks, is there any self-correcting mechanism going on? So let's make things simple by imagining that we just have a supply shock. So we are here. The way the self-correcting mechanism worked in the case of a demand shock was, well, actually we had two different ways of thinking about it, but they both kind of led us in the same direction. One was, in the case of demand shock, let's say it's a recessionary gap, the prices have dropped, the wage is stuck where it was before. Actually, let's go with an inflationary gap, because we have inflation. So in the case of an inflationary gap, the prices have risen, the wage is stuck, but sooner or later the wage rises and catches up with all the other prices, right? How is that intuition going to work here? There's a supply shock, prices have risen, the wages are stuck where they were before. What happens if the wages eventually rise to meet the higher prices? Which way does the supply curve go? It goes further to the left. That's not self-correcting. That's making matters worse. So that intuition, again, suggests this idea that once supply curves open a recessionary gap, they actually feed on themselves and make matters worse. There was the other intuition about how the self-correcting mechanism works, which was, well, suppose we're in this situation. We just fired a bunch of people because, well, the costs rose, so we don't want to make as much. Now, workers' bargaining power has diminished, right? Because unemployment is a more likely prospect. And so that would actually work in the opposite direction, and it would lead wages to decline. And if wages decline, of course, what does that do? It moves the supply curve back. But what's going on there then? We have one intuition that says we should expect the supply curve to go out, another one that says it should go back. It's not clear which one's going to win out, but one thing should be clear. It means the self-correcting mechanism doesn't work properly in this situation. If it works at all, it'll be much weaker than in the demand situation, where both paths of intuition lead in the same direction. So the problem is supply. So again, I guess the point is that when you have supply shocks, there isn't a mechanism at work that's going to help you get back to where you were before. Suggesting that when there are supply shocks, the argument for government intervention is even stronger than it is for dealing with demand shocks. Because again, the economy left on its own doesn't have tools to deal with stagflation. Okay? Any questions, comments, or thoughts about that? So we won't get to talk about what's the appropriate policy response, whether it's fiscal or monetary, to stagflation, because I see we have about half an hour left. I don't think that's enough time to do all of that. So instead, I think what we might do usefully is to come back and go through all this discussion again, thinking about our current predicament. Because there are various reasons why we might be worried about stagflation going forward. So let's just go down this list and see if these are things that we need to worry about. Oil price. What are oil prices doing? They're very high, and they might continue to go up. Why? Well, a collection of things. It used to be the case that energy markets were internationally fairly integrated, but that is no longer true because of various sanctions on Russia that limit its ability to supply energy to certain places, plus blowing up. Someone mysteriously blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, so that didn't exactly help the integration of international energy markets. So energy markets are fractured. That, of course, means we could probably expect higher energy prices, since it limits how much or which kinds of suppliers there are to different places. What about environmental regulation? Should you worry about that? Well, I already discussed the green transition. It's not clear if or when that's going to happen because obviously the green transition is a series of political decisions, and so it depends who's in power, but that is something, I guess, to be worried about at some point. What about expected inflation? Well, what's going on with expected inflation here? Maybe, I guess the question is, if we're going to think about how expected inflation might affect us and whether it might cause some sort of supply shock, I guess we need to spend a little bit thinking about how inflation forecasts are formed. There are, I guess, two views of this. One is that, I guess, if you are a highly sophisticated, well-trained economist, of course you would be forming your inflationary expectations by reading everything the Fed is putting out and studying all the economic data and drawing some inference from that. But ain't nobody got time for that. So in reality, what do you think most people use to forecast inflation? And you can think that through empathy or introspection. Sorry? Google. Well, I guess if I asked you what's the expected inflation rate, you might Google it. But in your day-to-day behavior, as discussed, as a forward-looking individual, you kind of implicitly, even if not consciously, have to have some idea in mind. Right? Do you think the inflation rate over the next 2 years is going to be 100%? No. So if the fact that you can answer no means you must have some idea of what's a reasonable range. And do people think about this all the time? Do people think about what the inflation rate is? Sit around making forecasts? Probably not, right? So where do they get their sort of inner subconscious expected inflation rate? Sorry? I guess from what they observe. Right? In other words, you probably think inflation is going to be roughly what it's been, unless there's any major reason otherwise. So let's have a look at what inflation has been. So again, this goes back to 1948, up to not very long ago. So here are the 70s, late 60s, inflation rises. There's a dip, then it rises again, then it gets out of control, then it goes down. Inflation rate is fairly steady throughout the 90s. Then we have some deflation in 2008, and then it comes back up again. Then we have some more, and then whoops, okay, that's us. That's us now. Observing high inflation now for at least a year, right? Well, actually, if you think about it, there's been these little pops here and there of inflation, even starting in 2020. Why was that? What happened in 2020? It's a normal year, right? So in 2020, COVID hit, and COVID did something very interesting to the economy. There were two sides to it. One which was a short-term thing, but it had one aspect that had short-term impacts, but it had another aspect that's having a long-term impact that we're still kind of dealing with. The short-term impact, as we've discussed before, was a massive collapse in aggregate demand, right? 10% of people thrown out of work because, well, we just stopped buying certain things entirely. And then what did the government do to deal with that? They started giving out stimulus checks. The Fed crunched interest rates to zero and started being the lender of last resort for basically everything. So the most massive imaginable stimulus ever. I think within weeks, the two main parties in Congress somehow managed to agree on something, and it was like a $2 trillion spending package to try and, like, unheard of magnitude of stimulus. So we had the short-term collapse, but that stimulus, kept on going. You can't spend $2 trillion in 5 minutes. So they could have overshot. That would have caused some inflation, not supply shock, but it would have caused some inflation. So COVID messed with our aggregate demand big time. It crunched it first, and then the government tried to push back and may have overshot. But the second thing that COVID did, which we're still dealing with, is that it also caused a supply shock, which is ongoing. And so an example of this is the following. When COVID first hit, what was the first public policy measure that anyone took to try and deal with COVID? The Chinese government shut down Wuhan and the suburbs around it. And interestingly, even though Wuhan is kind of far away, that had the impact of causing problems for companies over here. For example, Coca-Cola suddenly struggled to make its main product because it turns out that there's some dye or some pigment in Coca-Cola that is produced by only one factory, and that one factory was in Wuhan. So this is a little example of how COVID interfered with the way the economy works nowadays, which is that their production nowadays requires a sort of basically global network of suppliers for different components. And if you shut down a city, suddenly any component that's coming from there is off the market. So anyone who needs it anywhere in the world can't get it. Or an alternative example. Some months ago, Shanghai was on lockdown. Shanghai is one of the biggest ports in the world. So suddenly, anything that's coming from anywhere in China, even if it's not locked down, can't get out to the global market because the port's shut down. So that's a supply shock, right? Suddenly, various bits and pieces. Actually, what happened? About a year and a half ago, I decided to get some construction done on my house. So I ordered some doors and windows to replace the ones I had. And it took a year before they were delivered because they just ran out. Because they couldn't make them. Because they didn't have certain inputs that they needed to make the doors and windows. So that's another source of supply shocks. It's kind of you can imagine the global supply chains don't get disrupted that badly often, but if they do, that's, again, the whole thing about supply shocks is that they don't happen that often, but when they do, they can be bad. They cause stagflation. So we probably want to add supply chain fragility to our list. Right? Supply chains aren't a problem. The problem is that they may be vulnerable. And one of the things that's happening nowadays, bringing this back to the today discussion, is that whereas before 2020 there was such a thing as global supply chains where everyone was integrated, now there seems to be some disintegration. There's a combination of policy decisions. Let's say, for example, you may have heard of the CHIPS Act. The United States wants to bring the production of semiconductors back home. Well, doing that is going to be a supply shock because it will mess with the supply chains that are there pre-existing will have to be replaced by new ones. That will take time, will be costly. It's going to be a supply shock too. So, and furthermore, again, as we were discussing, once a supply shock happens, or rather once inflation happens, whether it's from demand or supply side, and it's persistent, and it's persistent to the point where it starts to feed into expected inflation, then you have an additional factor of supply shocks from the wages, which can lead the inflation to spin out of control. So we should be worried about supply shocks going forward, even though they are fairly rare. All right? Any questions, comments, or thoughts about that cheerful prospect? Very well. Let's see how we are doing for time. We have about 50 minutes left, and so that gives us enough time for our exit quiz. First question, type your answer. The relationship we discussed at the beginning of class today is the what curve? Of course, it is the Phillips curve. Next, the Phillips curve relates what two variables? Of course, it is inflation and unemployment. True or false? The Phillips curve slopes downwards. course, the answer is true. Stagflation is when what? Stagflation is when inflation and unemployment both rise. Stagflation is caused by negative supply shocks. True or false? Of course, the answer is true. This is the last question. What is an example of a negative supply shock? The copper price drops, government spending drops, the oil price rises, or the Fed funds rate drops. Right. Of course, the oil price increases. And the last one is a poll. I just want to see your opinion. In general, the green transition is a good idea. Yes, no, I'm not sure, or I don't care. Let's see. The answer is yes, apparently. All right, let's see how we did. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful. And if you want to talk to me in office hours, don't forget to book for tomorrow. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Good job, Damon. All right, everyone, take care. Look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.